8 years of my sweat paid for her law degree, only for Xenia to hand me divorce papers on the night of her victory gala. She laughed, calling me dead weight and a useless burden to her elite colleagues, never realizing that I, Baldric, was the senior attorney ghostwriting every win she ever had. Now, 5 years later, she's begging for mercy after discovering 200 warnings I left in her wake, warnings that have now become her federal indictment. She wanted a life with no burdens? Fine. I'll let the cold weight of a prison cell be the last thing she ever earns from me. The neon lights of the city blurred into a jagged smear of red and gold as I adjusted the cheap fabric of my disguise, my mind flashing back to the moment the trap was first set. The humidity of the Chicago evening clung to the glass walls of the rooftop lounge like a suffocating shroud. I stood in the peripheral shadows, the gold-trimmed vest of a high-end waiter pulling tight across my shoulders. It was a cheap polyester fabric, a far cry from the hand-tailored wool suits I had locked away in a private storage unit 8 years ago. Through the clinking of crystal and the low hum of self-important laughter, I watched Xenia. She was radiant, draped in silk that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, surrounded by the elite of the Chicago Bar Association. For 2,920 days, I had lived a double life. I had driven for Uber until my eyes blurred and hauled freight at the rail yards until my knuckles bled, all to fund the woman who was now the star of the show. I remember the day I walked away from my senior partnership at the Loop's most prestigious firm. My father, Reginald, had called me useless then, unable to fathom why I would pause my skyrocketing career. They didn't know that Xenia was drowning in her first year of law school, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the curriculum. I didn't drop out because I failed. I stepped down to become her ghostwriter, her tutor, and her bank account. I chose to be her anchor. My grandmother always told me that the strongest hands are those that carry others without asking for a receipt. I believe that. I believe that love was a silent investment in someone else's soul. Looking back now, I should have seen that some people don't want an anchor. They just want a stepping stone. The scent of expensive Chanel perfume drifted toward me as Xenia caught my eye. She didn't offer a smile of gratitude or a secret wink of shared victory. She looked at me with the clinical detachment one might reserve for a stain on a rug. I adjusted the silver tray in my left hand, my fingers brushing against the old signet ring my grandmother left me. It was the only piece of wealth I had left on my person. I wondered if any of the people in this room realized that the waiter pouring their vintage Bollinger had actually authored the very precedents they were debating. Probably not. To them, I was just background noise in the symphony of Xenia's success. "Baldric, come here," Xenia called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the jazz playing in the background. I approached the center of the circle, my pulse steady despite the mounting tension in the air. She didn't reach for a glass. Instead, she turned to the senior partner of a Tier 1 firm and gestured toward me with a mocking tilt of her head. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my financial aid program. He's been very helpful during my studies. But as they say in the courtroom, some evidence is only relevant for a limited time." A few people chuckled, a dry, hollow sound that made my stomach turn. I stood there, the silver tray a heavy weight between us, as she reached into her clutch and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She didn't hand it to me. She dropped it onto the tray right next to the crystal flutes. "Sign it, Baldric, right here in front of everyone. I want to start my career with a clean slate. No burdens needed." The words, "no burdens," echoed in my skull like a gunshot. 8 years of my life, the double shifts, the cold dinners, the discarded dreams, all reduced to a burden. She laughed then, a sound so brittle it finally shattered the last image I held of the woman I thought I loved. "You're serious," I said, my voice low and devoid of the tremor she likely expected. I looked into her eyes and saw a stranger. Sometimes people don't change. They just finally take off the mask when they think they no longer need you. I didn't make a scene. I didn't scream about the tuition or the sacrifices. I simply took the pen she'd offered and signed every page of the divorce petition right there on the silver tray. I realized in that moment that peace is far too expensive to waste on people who value a price tag over a soul. I handed the tray back to her, the papers now legally binding, and gave her a small, chilling smile of true liberation. The crowd went silent as my father, Reginald, stepped out from behind a pillar, followed by my brothers, Maynard and Garrick. I expected a reprimand for Xenia's cruelty, but Reginald's face was a mask of cold disappointment. A man who chooses to be a laborer when he had the world at his feet is no son of mine, he stated, his voice booming with the authority of a former judge. He didn't look at the divorce papers. He handed me a second document, a renunciation of heritage. Maynard and Garrick need the capital from your grandmother's estate to fund Xenia's new boutique firm. Since you're so fond of being useful to her, sign this and leave the family name behind. I looked at my brothers, the men I had bailed out of trouble more times than I could count, and saw only greed. They wanted the house, the history, and the dignity I had spent a decade protecting. They were asking me to erase myself. It was a total bloodline erasure, a calculated move to ensure the useless one could never claim a seat at their table again. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I realized that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. I signed the renunciation without a word. I didn't do it out of weakness. I did it because I refused to belong to a legacy that traded loyalty for a bigger office. Are you finished? I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness of the rooftop. Reginald nodded curtly, already turning back to the bar. I stripped off the waiter's vest and dropped it onto the floor. Standing there in my plain white shirt, I felt lighter than I had in years. I turned and walked toward the elevator, the rain beginning to lash against the windows. I didn't look back at the lights, the champagne, or the family that had just sold my soul for a percentage of a boutique firm. I had been erased, but in that erasure, I had found the space to finally become myself again. As I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on the life I had built for someone else, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hand didn't shake as I dialed a number I had kept in the deepest recesses of my memory for 8 long years. The phone rang once, then twice. A woman's voice, sharp and professional, answered on the third ring. Baldrick? Is that you? I looked at my reflection in the polished chrome of the elevator car, the reflection of a man who was no longer playing a part. Alara, I said, my voice cracking like a whip. It's time to stop pretending. I'm coming back to the loop. 48 hours ago, I was a ghost serving champagne on a rooftop. Now, as the rain-slicked pavement of Chicago's loop hums beneath my shoes, I feel the weight of 8 years falling away like dead skin. I stood before the polished granite facade of the Willis Tower, watching my reflection in the revolving glass doors. The man staring back wasn't the useless waiter, with tired eyes and a polyester vest. I had reclaimed the midnight blue bespoke Brioni suit I'd kept in a climate-controlled locker, a suit that spoke the language of power before I even opened my mouth. The fabric was cold, sharp, and carried the faint scent of a life I had paused but never truly lost. The lobby was a cathedral of high finance and higher stakes. As I approached the security desk, the air seemed to settle, a quiet anticipation building in the hum of the ventilation. I didn't reach for a visitor's pass. I placed my palm on the biometric scanner I hadn't touched in nearly a decade. The light blinked green, a silent acknowledgement that the chief advisor had returned from his self-imposed exile. The head receptionist, a woman who had seen the rise and fall of a dozen legal dynasties, froze. Her eyes widened as she stood up, giving a slight, respectful bow. Welcome back, Mr. Baldrick. Your suite has been maintained as requested. I nodded, my stride rhythmic and certain. Walking toward the private elevator bank, I reflected on a truth most people never learn. The greatest victory isn't beating your enemy in a shouting match. It's becoming someone they can no longer reach. For years, I allowed myself to be small, so Xenia could feel big. I thought I was being a martyr, but I was actually being a gardener for a weed. Now, I touched the heavy signet ring on my finger. Justice is a dish that must be served with a clean conscience and a razor-sharp mind. I didn't come back for the ego. I came back to ensure the scale actually balanced. The elevator climbed 60 floors in total silence. When the doors opened, Alara was waiting in the hallway. A federal judge with eyes that could see through a brick wall. She was the only person who knew why I had vanished into the shadows of the freight yards. She looked at my suit, then at my face, a slow smile spreading across her lips. The waiter costume finally wore out, I take it? She asked, her voice carrying the warmth of a long-standing alliance. 8 years is a long time to play pretend, Baldrick. I was starting to think you'd forgotten who you were. We walked into a glass-walled corner office that looked out over the gray, churning waters of Lake Michigan. I sat behind the mahogany desk, feeling the familiar chill of the air conditioning. Alara leaned against the window frame, her expression turning professional. You were right to step away when you did, but you're just in time for the wreckage. Xenia's new boutique firm? It's already throwing off red flags at the federal level. Your father, Reginald, and those brothers of yours, they didn't just give her money. They funneled it through offshore accounts in the Caymans that have been flagged for suspicious wire transfers. The news didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it might. Instead, I felt a heavy, lingering sadness for the family that had just sold me out. Maynard and Garrick never could resist a shortcut, I murmured, staring at the digital ledger Alara slid across the desk. I looked at the names, the dates, and the blatant disregard for the Bank Secrecy Act. They thought they were building a throne for their new favorite success story, but they were actually building a gallows. I looked up at Alara. Whatever happens with the investigation, I need you to ring-fence my grandmother's estate. I want that house untouched by their greed. It's the only part of our bloodline that isn't stained. Alara nodded, her pen hovering over a legal pad. I can secure the title under a protective trust, but Xenia is already listing it as collateral for her firm's line of credit. She's moving fast, Baldrick. She thinks she's untouchable because she has the right last name and a law degree. I leaned back, my eyes narrowing. I didn't leave her to watch her fail. I left her so I could finally breathe. If she falls, it won't be because I pushed her. It will be because she didn't know how to carry the weight of her own ambition without my hands holding up the floor. I spent the next 4 hours buried in the internal digital ledger of the firm. My senior level clearance allowed me to trace the flow of funds with a precision Xenia couldn't even imagine. I watched as Maynard's investment moved from a shell company in Delaware into Xenia's operating account. It was a textbook case of wire fraud, wrapped in the arrogance of people who believe they are smarter than the system. Blood doesn't make you family, I realized, tracing the signatures. Integrity makes you a man. My brothers had chosen their side long ago. They had just waited until the rooftop party to show me the bill. The office grew dark as the Chicago sun dipped below the skyline, leaving only the blue glow of my monitors. I scrolled through Xenia's most recent court filings, cases she'd won using the research I had secretly provided for years. Without my ghostwriting, her logic was brittle. She had made a massive procedural error in a high-profile real estate merger, a mistake so glaring it would trigger an automatic federal audit within 6 months. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, cheering for her own reflection. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Looking back now, I see that I wasn't just her husband. I was her camouflage. By removing myself, I had stripped away her protection. I didn't need to strike back with anger. I just had to step aside and let the reality of her own choices catch up to her. I stared at the blinking cursor, the silence of the high-rise suite wrapping around me like a shield. I had spent 8 years being the anchor that kept her from drifting away. Now, she would have to learn to swim in a sea of her own making. The high-rise suite felt like a fortress, but even the thickest glass couldn't dampen the persistent vibration of my burner phone on the mahogany desk. It was a rhythmic, nagging pulse, mimicking the erratic heartbeat of a family I was trying to save from themselves. My monitors were glowing with the cold, blue light of disaster. I had spent the last 6 hours tracing the representation agreements Xenia had signed for Maynard and Garrick's latest development project. It wasn't just a bad deal. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in a felony-grade bow. Under Rule .2d of the model rules, she was committing professional suicide. She was dancing on the edge of a federal indictment, and she was doing it with a smile. I leaned back, the silence of the office wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. My grandmother used to say that true kindness isn't about being liked. It's about doing the right thing even when you're the most hated person in the room. I held no malice toward them, only a profound, weary sense of duty. I began a systematic attempt to reach her, sending encrypted messages that detailed every legal trap her brothers had set. I pointed out the offshore inconsistencies and the wire fraud triggers. Each call went to voicemail. Each message was left unread. I was shouting into a void that Xenia had filled with her own vanity. Have you ever tried to stop someone from running off a cliff, only for them to tell you they're learning to fly? It's a special kind of exhaustion. By noon, I had made nearly 200 attempts to warn her. I knew her schedule. She was hosting a victory lunch, at her flashy new boutique firm to celebrate the very contracts that would eventually be her undoing. My fingers lingered over the call button one last time. I wasn't begging for her back. I was trying to prevent the total destruction of the woman I had spent 8 years building up. I hit dial. I waited. This time, she didn't just ignore it. She answered. But there was no hello. Instead, there was a roar of laughter and the distinct sound of a room full of people listening. "Listen up, everyone!" Xenia's voice boomed through the speaker, amplified by a conference phone. "The useless one is calling again. He's reached 200. Should we give him a trophy for persistence?" The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, and public. I sat perfectly still, my knuckles whitening as I listened to her mock my concern. She didn't realize I was trying to save her license. She thought I was trying to save our marriage. She recorded the call, her voice dripping with artificial pity, as she told me to get a life and stop obsessing over a lawyer who outgrew a waiter. Within 10 minutes, a video appeared on her professional social media page. It was edited, stripped of context, making me look like an unstable ex-husband desperate for a second chance. The caption read, "Success attracts predators, but failure breeds stalkers." I watched it go viral, the comments filling with strangers ridiculing a man they didn't know. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment my obligation finally died. I didn't feel anger. I felt a hollow, chilling silence. I had been a protector for so long that I forgot you cannot wake someone who is pretending to be asleep. Her arrogance had finally blinded her to the very laws she claimed to practice. I stopped the calls. I closed the forensic software and archived every message, every timestamp, and every outgoing log. These weren't for revenge. They were admissible evidence of my good faith effort to mitigate harm. If the federal government ever questioned my involvement, I would have 200 proofs that I tried to stop the crime. I met Alara in the hallway shortly after. She was holding her tablet, her face pale with fury at the viral post. "Baldric, this is disgusting," she hissed. "She's destroying your reputation to build hers." I shook my head slowly. "No, Alara. She's just documenting her own intent to ignore the truth." I calmly signed off on the final investigation report into the brothers' development group. Mercy that encourages evil is not mercy, but complicity. I had done my part as a guardian. Now, I had to fulfill my role as a witness. I prepared a duty to inform report for the disciplinary committee, but I didn't send it. I placed it in my private safe. I would only use it when the law demanded it, not out of a petty need to strike back. Character is what you do when the world thinks you're a villain. I realized then that my family didn't just need a lawyer. They needed a mirror, and the reflection was going to be terrifying. In a small act of reclamation, I sent an anonymous donation to a local legal aid clinic in my grandmother's name. It was a way to center myself on real justice, away from the toxic drama of the rooftop and the boutique firm. I felt my spirit settling, the you at UC of the public humiliation being replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. I had given them every chance to turn back. I had laid out the map to safety, and they had used it as confetti for their party. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew the season of protection was over. As the sun began to set over the loop, casting long, jagged shadows across my desk, a high-priority notification pinged on my encrypted screen. It was an automated alert from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's case management system. The FBI had officially opened a file on Xenia's boutique firm. Her name was at the very top of the suspect list for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I stared at the red text, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The shadow of the law was finally stretching over her bright, artificial world. She had no idea that the useless one was the only person who could see the bars of the cage closing in. The low, frantic hum of voices drifted through the vents of my monitoring suite, filtered through high-gain microphones I had placed in Reginald's Bridgeport study months ago. It was midnight. The city outside was a jagged landscape of steel and freezing rain. But inside that mahogany-paneled room, a different kind of storm was breaking. I sat in the dark, the blue glow of my monitors illuminating the sharp lines of my face. I watched the thermal signatures of my father and brothers pacing like trapped animals. The news of the FBI's interest in the Maynard Garrick Development Group had finally pierced their bubble of arrogance. The golden facade wasn't just cracking, it was hemorrhaging. "The feds flagged the offshore transfers." Maynard's voice crackled through my speakers, thick with a desperation I hadn't heard since he nearly went bankrupt 10 years ago. They're tracing the wire fraud directly back to Xenia's boutique firm. If she goes down, she's taking the whole group with her. I watched Xenia on the screen, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of scotch. This was the legal epicenter of the fraud. My father, Reginald, stood by the fireplace, his shadow looming large against the books he claimed to live by. Have you ever noticed how quickly family values dissolve when a prison sentence enters the room? It's a sobering sight. Reginald didn't speak of justice. He didn't ask how they could make things right. Instead, he paced the Persian rug, his mind churning with the cold calculus of survival. "We have to protect the name," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Xenia is a lawyer. If she loses her license, our influence in the city vanishes. We need a sacrificial lamb, someone who doesn't matter." I leaned forward, my breath hitching. I knew that tone. It was the tone of a man about to betray his own blood. A house built on sand doesn't need a storm to fall. It only needs the truth to rise. I didn't realize it then, but that moment was the final death of my childhood. The conversation turned darker, more rhythmic, like the steady closing of a trap. Maynard stepped into the center of the room, pulling a dusty manila box from a shelf. "I found these," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Old documents Baldric signed years ago. Minor paperwork he did for us while he was busy playing servant for Xenia." He laid the papers out on the desk, the light of the green banker's lamp casting long, sickly shadows over them. I watched through the camera as they hovered over the pages. They weren't looking at memories. They were looking at weapons. "We can forge the new contracts," Garrick added, his eyes bright with a predatory gleam. "We backdate them. We make it look like Baldric was the one directing the offshore movements. He was the useless one, right? No one will believe he had the brains to do it alone, but they'll believe he was the fall guy we used." It was a cold, calculated, cinematic maneuver. They were planning to testify that I, the son who had worked double shifts to keep them afloat, was actually the mastermind who had manipulated their innocence. The irony was so thick, I could almost taste it. I waited for my father to stop them. I waited for Reginald, the man who lectured me on honor for 30 years, to tell them that destroying his youngest son was a line they couldn't cross. But the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he nodded. "Baldric is already a nobody," Reginald said, and the words felt like a physical blow to my chest. "He has no career, no status, and no one in this city cares if he disappears into a federal cell. But Xenia has a future. We protect the successful. We discard the weight." I stared at the screen, my eyes dry, my heart turning into a block of obsidian. Forgiveness doesn't mean staying for the next blow. It means knowing Kinao to walk away forever. I watched my own father agree to send me to prison to save the vanity of a woman who had already discarded me. It was the ultimate Judas covenant. I wasn't just being excluded anymore. I was being erased by the people who were supposed to be my sanctuary. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. The signs were always there, hidden in the way they looked past me at Thanksgiving dinners. I closed the video feed. The silence in my suite was absolute, a shield against the rot I had just witnessed. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. Instead, I stood up and walked to my main server. My knuckles were white, but my mind was a razor. "All right," I whispered to the empty room. "If you want a mastermind, I'll show you what one actually looks like." I began a digital forensic sweep of every document I had ever touched for that family. I utilized my senior-level access to the firm's legal tech to create a blockchain-verified timeline of my actual signatures versus the forgeries they were currently practicing. I worked with a clinical precision that would have terrified Xenia. I gathered metadata from the brothers' computers, proving they were accessing the fraud files at the exact hours I was clocked in at the freight yards or driving an Uber across town. I was building an airtight alibi, a digital wall that no lie could penetrate. Even as I mapped out their destruction, I noticed a notification on my secondary screen. Reginald's heart medication refill was overdue. Despite everything, I picked up the phone and made a quiet call to his private doctor to ensure the delivery was made. His sins are his own, but my character is mine. I refuse to become a monster just because I'm being hunted by them. The architecture of my defense was a masterpiece of legal realism. I prepared a counter affidavit embedding the forensic evidence into a secure vault that would trigger if I were ever detained. It's funny how pain becomes the thing that wakes you up. I spent 8 years being the anchor, the one who took the weight so they could float. Now, I was becoming the tide. I remember my grandmother saying that it's not what they do to you that defines you, but how you rise after the fall. I was rising, and I was doing it with the quiet power of a man who has nothing left to lose. By 4 a.m., the defense file was complete. I sat back, the first gray light of a Chicago dawn beginning to touch the edges of the skyscrapers. I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect of the truth. I looked at the manila envelope on my desk, the one containing the evidence of their wire fraud and my innocence. I reached for my phone and typed a single, cryptic text to Xenia. It was the only warning she would get, the last vestige of the man who had loved her. The ink you use to write a lie eventually becomes the blood on your own hands. Choose carefully. I hit send. I watched the delivered icon appear. I knew she was awake, huddled in that study with the ghosts of my family, plotting my ruin. She didn't realize that the trial of her life was no longer in a courtroom. It was happening right now, in the heart of the man she had called useless. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city wake up. I didn't know exactly what was waiting for me next, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The morning light broke over the Chicago skyline, cold and indifferent, but the atmosphere inside my high-floor sanctuary was charged with a clinical, predatory stillness. On the television screen across from my desk, the public execution of my reputation had begun. Reginald, my own father, stood before a phalanx of microphones outside the Dirksen courthouse, his eyes wet with rehearsed tears. He spoke of a prodigal son who had manipulated the family's good name to orchestrate a massive development fraud. Xenia stood behind him, playing the role of the blindsided professional, her lawyers leaking forged documents to every major news outlet in the city. I watched the thermal signatures of the media frenzy, feeling the sharp, cold sting of a betrayal that went deeper than bone. A lie can travel halfway around the world, while the truth is still putting on its shoes, but I didn't reach for the phone to issue a denial. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the silence around me acting as a shield. The loud roar of a lie is nothing compared to the quiet thunder of an absolute fact, and I had a sky full of lightning waiting in my servers. Even as the anchors debated my downfall, I focused on a different task. I leaned into my intercom and spoke to Alara. Make sure the trust for the grandmother's estate is fully insulated from any federal asset forfeiture aimed at Reginald or the brothers. I want that house protected, regardless of what they've done to me. Character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. While the media feasted on the scapegoat plot, the federal noose was quietly tightening elsewhere. The FBI didn't care about the useless husband narrative being spun on the evening news. Their forensic accountants had spent the night flagging the metadata from Maynard and Garrick's offshore transfers, metadata that I had carefully highlighted for them through back-channel tips. By noon, the tactical teams moved in. They didn't raid my office, they raided Xenia's boutique firm. I watched the live feed as agents carried out boxes of files, the golden girl of Chicago law suddenly looking very small beneath the weight of a felony conspiracy charge. Xenia's genius legal strategy had left a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to her own doorstep. She tried to invoke her Ivy League connections, making frantic calls to partners who had clinked glasses with her only weeks ago. Every door slammed shut. In the high-stakes world of federal wire fraud, success is a fair-weather friend. She began to hear whispers of the ghost, the elusive chief advisor to the federal court who had the power to review indictments and bury evidence if the price was right. She finally understood that power isn't about the gold letters on your office door. It's about whose call the judge actually picks up. Her status was a house of cards, and the wind was picking up. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and Xenia was running on pure, unadulterated terror. Facing 20 years in a federal facility, she decided to hunt the only person she thought could save her, the mysterious legal assassin she knew only as the Ghost. She spent her last liquid assets, money she should have used for a defense attorney, to bribe a disgruntled clerk for the location of the Ghost's private office. She didn't realize she was being led by the hand into the very heart of my domain. I watched her GPS signal move toward the Willis Tower, a slow, rhythmic approach that felt like a funeral march. I prepared for her arrival with a cold, methodical calm. On my desk, I placed a Goodwill package, a folder containing the fully funded medical trust for Reginald's heart condition. Even when people treat you like garbage, you don't have to become the trash they think you are. I checked the wall-mounted notice of recording sign, ensuring it was visible and compliant with Illinois' two-party consent laws. Every word she spoke in this room would be her final confession. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth to be spoken in her own voice. I adjusted my tie and sat in the shadows, the city lights beginning to twinkle outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I heard the heavy click of her heels in the hallway, a sound of false confidence and hidden trembling. Looking back now, I should have seen that she would always choose the shadow over the light. She had spent 8 years ignoring my warnings, and now she was coming to me as a supplicant, still believing she was the smartest person in the room. I felt a profound sense of closure. The useless one was about to become the most important person in her world. The shadow of her figure appeared against the frosted glass of my office door. I watched her pause, smoothing her hair and practicing the desperate, seductive plea she intended to use on the man she thought was a stranger. She took a deep breath, the sound audible through the sensitive microphones. She thought she was about to meet the most powerful lawyer in Chicago, ready to sell whatever was left of her soul for a chance to win. She had no idea that the trial of her life was already over. Xenia pushed the door open, the heavy oak swinging wide. She stepped into the dim light, her eyes searching the shadows for the man behind the desk. "I am looking for the chief advisor," she whispered, her voice a mix of terror and practiced charm. "I was told he was the only one who could help me." I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, a suffocating weight that filled the room. I slowly turned my chair toward her, the light from the monitors finally catching my face. I watched the blood drain from her skin until she was as white as the snow falling outside. She stood frozen, her hand still clutching the door handle. The silence in the office was absolute, a cinematic pause before the final collapse. I looked at her, not with anger, but with a weary, intellectual dominance. "I believe you're in the right place, Xenia," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But I think you've drastically misunderstood the price of admission." She stared at me, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. The useless one was staring back. And for the first time in 5 years, she truly understood the magnitude of what she had thrown away. Xenia stood paralyzed in the doorway of my executive suite, her practiced charm dissolving like salt in a Chicago storm. I watched the light from my monitors play across her face, highlighting the sheer terror in her eyes. She had come here to seduce a phantom, to bribe a ghost into saving her from 20 years in a federal cell. Instead, she found the man she had discarded on a rainy rooftop 5 years ago. I didn't say a word. I let the silence of the 50th floor do the heavy lifting. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a while, but it ain't going away. I could see her mind racing, trying to reconcile the useless waiter with the chief federal advisor sitting behind a mahogany desk that cost more than her entire firm. Earlier that night, Xenia had used her final legal key, a temporary access token to the federal PACER database, before her license was officially flagged for suspension. She had been hunting for the man she knew only as the ghost. As she scrolled through the secure portal, her breath hitching in the cold dark of her own office, the screen had blinked and finally revealed the truth. The name Baldrick stared back at her in high-resolution clarity. Beside it sat the metadata logs, a digital trail showing that every winning brief she had filed over the last 8 years had been secretly ghostwritten from my secure IP address. My name wasn't just on her divorce papers. It was the foundation of her entire professional existence. She had scrolled further, discovering the archives of the 200 calls she had mocked in front of her colleagues. In the clinical silence of the digital archive, she finally listened to them. They weren't the desperate pleas of a lonely man. They were specific, expert legal alerts regarding the Maynard Garrick fraud. I had given her the exact statutes, the filing numbers, and the warnings about the FBI's wire fraud triggers. Every time she had put me on speaker to draw a laugh, she had been broadcasting the sound of her own salvation being rejected. She realized then that her genius was nothing but a gift from the man she called deadweight. Her arrogance had been her only real burden. Xenia didn't stay alone for long. She had rushed to Bridgeport, waking Reginald and my brothers in a frantic panic. I watched their thermal signatures on my security feed as she revealed the truth. The arrogance that had defined my family for decades evaporated in an instant. Reginald, the man who prided himself on knowing every power player in the city, looked like he had seen a ghost. He realized he had discarded a king for 3 pawns. They didn't feel remorse, of course. They felt fear. They immediately began plotting to play the family card, hoping that the baldric who had paid their bills and endured their insults was still lurking beneath the suit. I received the notification from my lobby security that they were downstairs. "Let them up," I said into the intercom. I wasn't doing it to gloat. I was doing it because even a dying fire deserves to be watched until the last ember fades. I wanted them to see the reality of what they had built. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, my back to the door, silhouetted against the glittering lights of Lake Michigan. I looked like a titan, a man who had rebuilt himself from the ashes of their betrayal. I didn't realize it then, but this was the moment that would finally close the wound of my childhood. The mahogany doors swung open. I heard Reginald's heavy, uneven footsteps, followed by the frantic whispers of Maynard and Garrick. They stopped a few feet from my desk. Reginald didn't lead with an apology. He fell to his knees, his voice cracking with a desperate, artificial warmth. "Baldric, my favorite son, we were so wrong. We were just stressed. We didn't know what we were saying." Xenia stood behind him, trying to soften her expression, her eyes searching for the man who used to look at her with adoration. She found only a stranger. I stood there, watching their performance, feeling a profound sense of detachment. "I stopped being your son the moment you signed my federal prison sentence in your study," I said, my voice like a razor cutting through silk. I turned around slowly, the light from the city making my eyes look like chips of ice. "And I stopped being your husband, Xenia, when you turned my final warnings into a social media joke for your friends. You wanted a fresh start without dead weight. Well, here I am. I'm the weight that was keeping you all from sinking." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough to fill the room. Reginald reached out a trembling hand toward me, but I didn't move. I reached into my desk and pulled out a single document. "This is a medical trust fund," I said, sliding it across the mahogany. "It's fully funded and covers your heart surgery and long-term care. I do this because I am my grandmother's grandson, not because I am your son. My character is not dependent on your worthiness." For a second, a flicker of genuine shame crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by the stench of greed as he realized the document didn't include a legal pardon. A man who values himself doesn't need to punish those who don't. I looked at Xenia, who was trying to find the words to ask for a defense. I could see the gears turning in her head, still looking for a loophole. "The world will give you the justice you deserve," I told them. "I don't need to lift a finger." I gestured to the 2 security guards waiting by the door. "This meeting is over. You've used up your last bit of family credit." They began to scream then. Maynard and Garrick hurling the same old insults, their masks finally slipping back into place. As security escorted them toward the elevator, I walked over to Xenia. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. I reached into my jacket and handed her a final envelope. It wasn't a love letter or a check. It was a formal subpoena from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "See you in court, counselor," I said, my voice a quiet, devastating whisper. "This time, I won't be writing your defense. I'll be reading your verdict." I watched the elevator doors close on their pleas, leaving me alone in the silence of my tower. That's where it all truly ended. The mahogany doors of the suite slammed shut behind my family, the finality of the sound vibrating through the soles of my shoes. Standing there in the absolute silence of the tower, I watched through the glass as the biting Chicago wind whipped through the streets below. My family was out there now, small and vulnerable, finally stripped of the armor my silence had provided. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I expected. Instead, I felt a strange, somber peace. The trial was no longer a looming shadow. It was a path I had cleared with my own hands. That was where the old baldric finally let go, and the man I was meant to be took his first real breath. The federal courtroom in downtown Chicago felt like a tomb of cold marble and heavy oak. I sat at the prosecution's table as the lead technical consultant, my back straight, my expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Xenia looked like a ghost of the woman who had stood on that rooftop. She attempted a desperate, last-ditch defense, her voice trembling as she tried to argue that I had coerced her into the very fraud I had warned her about. I didn't interrupt. I let her dig the hole until the judge's patience finally ran out. Then, with a quiet nod from the U.S. attorney, I stood up and activated the courtroom's audio system. The room filled with the unedited recordings of my 200 calls. There was no begging, no desperate pleas for love, just my voice, steady and professional, reciting the exact federal statutes she was violating and the specific wire fraud triggers her brothers were setting off. The useless man she had mocked on social media was revealed to be her only guardian. I looked Xenia directly in the eye as the judge pronounced the disbarment order. "You wanted a life with no burdens, Xenia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying to every corner of the room. "Now, the weight of your own choices is the only thing you have left to carry. The law is a mirror. It doesn't create your face. It only shows you what you've become." The legal realism of the moment was clinical. I presented the blockchain-verified metadata that proved Maynard and Garrick had forged my signatures while I was clocked in miles away at the rail yards. The brothers were let out in handcuffs, their faces twisted in a mixture of shock and fury. Xenia's boutique firm was liquidated before the sun went down. As the gavel fell for the final time, I realized that justice isn't about hurting people. It's about making sure the truth is the loudest thing in the room. I walked out of the Dirksen courthouse into the fading heat of a late summer afternoon, a free man in every sense of the word. A week later, I executed the final stage of my quiet reclamation. Using a constructive trust action, I successfully petitioned the court to return my grandmother's Victorian estate to my sole possession. I arrived at the ancestral home in Bridgeport not to gloat, but to supervise the legal eviction of the brothers' remaining belongings. Maynard and Garrick were on the lawn, screaming insults about my betrayal, but I remained calm. Resentment is a poison you drink hoping the other person dies. I refused to take a sip. I walked past them and into the house that smelled of lemon polish and old books. The house where I had been a happy child before the labels took over. In the hallway, I found Reginald sitting on a packing crate, his shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant. Despite the scars he had left on my spirit, I didn't feel hatred. I handed him the deed to a comfortable assisted living suite in the suburbs and the documents for his medical trust. "I do this because I am my grandmother's grandson, not because I am your son," I told him quietly. "You didn't deserve me, Reginald, but I deserve to live with a clean heart." He didn't look up, but his hand shook as he took the papers. I walked to the safe in the wall and retrieved my grandmother's ring and her letters. I had finally reclaimed the only pieces of my identity that their greed couldn't touch. 6 months have passed since the courtroom doors closed. Today, the sunset over Chicago is a deep, warm gold, spilling across the porch of the restored Victorian house. I stood there with Alara, the steam from my tea rising into the quiet evening air. The city skyline is still visible in the distance, a world I still influence, but one I no longer allow to dictate my worth. I looked at the garden I spent the morning weeding, feeling the grit of honest soil under my fingernails. Have any of you ever had to tear down your whole life just to find the foundation? It's painful, but the view from the other side is worth every tear. I looked at Alara and smiled, a genuine expression that reached my eyes. True success isn't about being seen by everyone. It's about being able to look at yourself in the mirror and not wanting to turn away. I thought of Xenia, likely sitting in a cramped apartment somewhere, still wondering how the useless one ended up with the crown. I didn't wish her ill. I just wished her the clarity to realize that the fresh start she wanted so badly was exactly what she got. It just so happened that her fresh start didn't include me, and mine finally included myself. I set my teacup down on the wooden table, the same brand my grandmother used to brew on Sunday mornings. The silence around the house was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was a companion. I had been erased by my family, then rebuilt by my own will. Looking back, I wouldn't change a single double shift or a single cold dinner, because they led me here, to a place where my name finally means something to the person who matters most. I took a deep breath of the cooling air, closed my eyes, and listened to the peaceful hum of a life that was finally completely mine. I've learned that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who sits back, listens, and observes. I spent 8 years being the shadow to her light, only to realize that it was my silence that gave her the power she eventually used against me. Never mistake someone's sacrifice for a lack of ambition or their kindness for weakness. I finally found my peace, but I have to ask you, if the person you built a life for called you dead weight after everything you gave them, would you have walked away as quietly as I did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.